Some secrets are meant to stay buried. But in 1914, a small Tennessee town learned that the dead don't always keep quiet. What happened inside that country church would haunt an entire community for generations, because the truth they heard from beyond the grave was darker than death itself. The morning of October 17, 1914, broke cold and gray over Bledsoe County, Tennessee. The kind of morning where the mist clings to the valley floor like something that doesn't want to let go. In the small community of Grassy Cove, population barely 300 souls, everyone knew everyone else's business. Or at least, they thought they did. But on this particular morning, as folks made their way down the muddy road toward the white clapboard church on the hill, they were about to discover just how wrong they'd been. The church bell tolled with that slow, mournful rhythm reserved for funerals. It echoed across the valley, bouncing off the limestone bluffs that surrounded the cove like the walls of a natural cathedral. 7-year-old Thomas Edwin Cartwright was being laid to rest. Little Tommy, as everyone called him, had died just 3 days earlier, under circumstances that the town doctor had labeled as natural causes. A fever, he'd said. Common enough in those days, especially as autumn gave way to the harsh mountain winter. But there were whispers. There are always whispers in small towns, aren't there? Hushed conversations that stop the moment someone walks into a room, knowing glances exchanged over Sunday dinner. The kind of gossip that spreads like wildfire through a community where entertainment is scarce and other people's tragedies become the currency of social interaction. Tommy's mother, Margaret Cartwright, was a figure of both sympathy and speculation. At 28 years old, she was raising Tommy alone after her husband, James, had died in a logging accident 2 years prior. She'd taken work as a seamstress, her fingers constantly moving, stitching together other people's lives while her own seemed to fray at the edges. She was known as a devout woman, never missing Sunday service, always the first to volunteer when the church needed help. But recently, people had noticed changes. She'd been seen in town with Clayton Murphy, a traveling salesman who'd set up temporary residence at the boarding house on Main Street. Murphy was smooth-talking, well-dressed by local standards, and had a way of making people believe whatever he was selling, whether it was patent medicine, farm equipment, or simply himself. He claimed to be widowed, claimed to be a man of means just passing through on business. But in a community where outsiders were viewed with inherent suspicion, his presence had set tongues wagging. The relationship between Margaret and Clayton had developed quickly. Too quickly, some said. Within weeks of his arrival, they were seen walking together after church, sharing meals at the hotel restaurant, and Murphy had even been spotted leaving the Cartwright house, well after dark, on multiple occasions. In 1914, rural Tennessee, such behavior was scandalous enough to be the subject of sermons that never quite mentioned names, but left no doubt about who was being discussed. And then Tommy had fallen ill. It started on a Tuesday evening. Margaret had rushed him to Dr. Amos Hendricks, the only physician within 20 miles, claiming the boy had suddenly developed a high fever and was vomiting. The doctor, an elderly man who'd been practicing medicine since before the Civil War, had examined Tommy and prescribed bed rest, cool compresses, and a tonic he mixed himself. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have led to what happened next. By Thursday morning, Tommy was dead. Margaret's screams had awakened the neighbors before dawn. When they arrived, they found her cradling the boy's small body, rocking back and forth, wailing in a grief so primal it barely seemed human. Clayton Murphy had been there too, standing in the corner of the bedroom, his face pale, his hands trembling. He'd left town that same afternoon, telling the boarding house keeper he had urgent business elsewhere. He promised to return for the funeral. He never did. Dr. Hendricks had signed the death certificate without hesitation. Fever, he wrote, the same thing that killed dozens of children every year in these mountains. There was no reason to suspect anything else. No reason at all, except for those whispers. Now, as the church filled with mourners dressed in their Sunday blacks, the whispers continued. Women clutched their handkerchiefs and spoke behind their hands. Men stood outside smoking, their conversations dying whenever Margaret approached. She walked through it all like a ghost herself, her face hidden behind a black veil, her body supported by her sister on one side and a cousin on the other. The coffin sat at the front of the church, elevated on 2 sawhorses. It was a simple pine box, built by the local carpenter, Herman Fisher. Herman had built dozens of coffins over his 40 years in business, but this one had troubled him. When he'd gone to the Cartwright house to measure Tommy's body, something had felt wrong. The boy's skin had an odd pallor to it, not the waxy yellow of fever death, but something else he couldn't quite name. And the smell. There'd been a faint odor he couldn't identify, almost sweet, almost chemical. He'd mentioned it to his wife that evening, but she'd told him he was being foolish, that grief was making him imagine things. The service began at 10 o'clock. Reverend Josiah Blackwood stood at the pulpit, his weathered Bible open before him, and began to speak about innocent lambs being called home to the Lord's eternal pasture. It was the same sermon he gave at every child's funeral, with minor variations. The words washed over the congregation like a familiar, sorrowful tide. In the third row, Emma Pritchard sat with her 3 children. She'd known Margaret since they were girls together, had been at her wedding, had helped her through James's death. But lately, she'd begun to distance herself. She'd seen things that troubled her. A bruise on Tommy's arm one Sunday at church. The boy had become quieter in recent months, less playful, more withdrawn. When Emma had asked Margaret about it, her old friend had become defensive. Claimed Tommy was just going through a phase, that all boys got rough playing in the woods. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had been deeply wrong in that household. And now, Tommy was dead, and Clayton Murphy had vanished like smoke, and Margaret sat in the front row, apparently shattered by grief. It all felt wrong somehow, like a story where the pieces didn't quite fit together. The Reverend was midway through the 23rd Psalm when it happened. The first sound was so faint that only those in the front rows heard it, a scratching noise, like a mouse in the walls. Several people glanced around, confused. Then it came again, louder this time, a distinct scraping sound, followed by something that made every person in that church freeze where they sat. A voice, small, weak, muffled but unmistakably present. It was coming from inside the coffin. "Help me, please, somebody help me." The words were barely audible, but in the shocked silence that had fallen over the church, they carried like thunder. The Reverend stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the autumn wind rattling the windows and that terrible, impossible voice from within the sealed pine box. "She put something in my food. Mama put something in my food. It made me sleep, but I'm not dead. Please, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. She wanted me gone. She said I was in the way. She said he didn't want me around. Please, somebody open the box. I'm scared. I'm so scared." What happened next would be debated and discussed for decades to come. Some people would claim they heard every word clearly. Others would insist they only heard muffled sounds, that the specific words were filled in later by hysterical imaginations. But everyone agreed on one thing. They all heard something coming from that coffin, and whatever it was, it stopped the funeral dead in its tracks. Margaret Cartwright let out a shriek that could have shattered glass. She lunged toward the coffin, but her sister and cousin held her back. She was screaming, incomprehensible words tumbling over each other. "No, no, no, it's not possible. He's dead. I saw him die. This is the devil's work. Don't listen. Don't open it. Please, God, don't open it." But several men were already moving. Herman Fisher, the carpenter, rushed forward with Thomas Brennan, the blacksmith, and William Cooper, who owned the general store. Their hands shook as they reached for the coffin lid. Herman had sealed it himself that morning with 8 nails, driven deep into the soft pine. He'd done it while Margaret watched, her face expressionless behind that black veil. Reverend Blackwood found his voice. "Wait," he commanded, his hand raised. "We must be calm. We must think clearly. It could be some kind of trick, some evil, designed to disturb the sanctity of this moment." But the voice came again, and this time there was no mistaking the desperation in it. "Please hurry. I'm so cold. Everything hurts." She gave me the medicine from the bottle that man brought. It made everything go dark. I tried to tell Dr. Hendricks, but I couldn't move, couldn't talk. I could hear everything, but I couldn't move. She told him I was dead, but I wasn't dead. I was just sleeping. Please, please let me out. The church erupted into chaos. Women were crying, men were shouting, children were being ushered outside by their terrified mothers. Emma Pritchard stood frozen in her pew, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She'd known. Deep in her gut, she'd known something was terribly wrong. Herman Fisher grabbed a crowbar from his tool bag. He'd brought it to make any final adjustments to the coffin's placement. But now his hands trembled as he wedged it under the lid. The nails groaned as they pulled free from the wood. 1, 2, 3. Each nail that came loose felt like an eternity. Margaret's screams had dissolved into a high, keening wail, and she'd collapsed to the floor, held down now by several women who feared what she might do. 4 nails. 5 nails. The voice inside had gone quiet. The entire church held its collective breath. What would they find when that lid came off? A living child, somehow survived against impossible odds? Or something else? Something their rational minds couldn't accept, but their terrified hearts believed might be real? 6 nails. 7 nails. Herman's face was white as the limestone cliffs outside. His hands slipped on the crowbar, slick with sweat despite the cold. Thomas Brennan stepped up to help him, adding his considerable strength. The 8th and final nail came free, with a shriek of wood and metal. Together, the 2 men lifted the coffin lid. The hinges creaked. The lid rose slowly, tilting back. And as it opened fully, as the interior of that pine box was revealed to the horrified congregation, a collective gasp swept through the church. Tommy Cartwright lay inside. Dressed in his Sunday best, his small hands were folded across his chest, just as Herman had positioned them. His eyes were closed. His face was pale and waxy. He looked, in every respect, exactly like what he was supposed to be. A dead child. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. There was no rise and fall of his chest, no flutter of eyelids, no sign whatsoever of life. The voice had stopped. The scratching had stopped. Everything had stopped. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by Margaret's sobbing and the sound of the wind. Then Dr. Hendricks, who'd been sitting in the back row, pushed his way forward. His old hands, still steady from decades of practice, reached into the coffin. He placed his fingers against Tommy's neck, searching for a pulse. He lowered his ear to the boy's chest. Listening for a heartbeat, he lifted one small, cold hand and checked for any sign of warmth or flexibility. Finally, he straightened up and faced the congregation. His voice, when he spoke, was heavy with the weight of his years and his authority. "This child is dead. He has been dead for 3 days. There is no life in this body. What you heard, what we all heard, I cannot explain. But I assure you, as a man of medicine and a man of God, that Thomas Edwin Cartwright is deceased." But the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had been planted, and in the soil of that small community, they would grow into something dark and tangled. Because regardless of what the doctor said, regardless of what their eyes showed them, every single person in that church had heard something. They'd heard a voice. They'd heard accusations. And they'd heard Margaret's reaction, her desperate pleas not to open the coffin. The funeral concluded in a state of barely controlled pandemonium. Reverend Blackwood rushed through the final prayers. The coffin was quickly sealed again, this time with 12 nails instead of 8. Tommy was buried in the churchyard cemetery, in a plot next to his father. Margaret was helped home by her relatives, sedated with laudanum by Dr. Hendricks, who'd brought his medical bag with him to the service. But the questions didn't get buried along with that small pine coffin. They multiplied and spread through Grassy Cove like a virulent infection. What had they heard? More importantly, what had Tommy's supposed voice accused? Margaret putting something in his food. Medicine from a bottle that a man had brought. Clayton Murphy, the traveling salesman who'd vanished so conveniently. Within days, the story had spread beyond Grassy Cove. Newspapers in Chattanooga picked it up. The Chattanooga Times ran a headline that screamed, "Child's voice heard from grave. Mother accused from beyond death." The story was sensational enough to be picked up by papers as far away as Nashville and Knoxville. Reporters descended on the small community, their notebooks ready, their pens hungry for details that would sell papers. The pressure mounted. Local authorities, initially dismissive of what they considered mass hysteria, found themselves forced to investigate. The county sheriff, a pragmatic man named Ezekiel Moss, had known Margaret Cartwright her entire life. He'd watched her grow up, had been at her wedding, had helped carry her husband's body out of the woods after the logging accident. He didn't want to believe she could harm her own child, but he also couldn't ignore what dozens of witnesses claimed to have heard. Sheriff Moss began his investigation reluctantly. He questioned Margaret, who maintained through her tears that she'd done nothing wrong, that her son had died of natural causes, that what people heard in the church was either their own imaginations or something supernatural. She refused to discuss Clayton Murphy beyond saying he'd been a friend who'd shown her kindness during a difficult time. The sheriff tracked down Dr. Hendrix's treatment records. Everything seemed in order. The symptoms Margaret had described were consistent with fever. The doctor's prescribed treatment was standard. But when Moss asked if Hendrix had performed any kind of thorough examination to determine cause of death, the old doctor admitted he hadn't. In those days, in that place, a simple fever was common enough that autopsies were rarely performed, especially on children. It seemed cruel to subject a grieving mother to such an ordeal when the cause of death appeared obvious. But now, with accusations flying and the entire county watching, an exhumation was ordered. On October 31st, 14 days after Tommy had been buried, his coffin was dug up from the cold Tennessee earth. The process was conducted at night, by lamplight, with only essential personnel present. Sheriff Moss, Dr. Hendrix, the county coroner who'd traveled from the county seat, and Herman Fisher, who'd built the coffin and could identify it with certainty. The coffin was opened for the second time. What they found inside would only deepen the mystery. Tommy's body showed signs of decomposition, consistent with having been dead for more than 2 weeks. But there were other findings that troubled the coroner. A younger man named Dr. Samuel Wright, who'd been trained at Vanderbilt and brought more modern medical knowledge to his examination. The boy's fingernails were broken and bloody. There were scratch marks on the inside of the coffin lid. His small hands, which had been folded peacefully across his chest, were now curled into claws at his sides. His face, which had been serene at the funeral, was now contorted in what appeared to be an expression of terror or pain. Dr. Wright's preliminary conclusion was disturbing. These findings are consistent with someone who was buried alive. The scratches, the position of the hands, the facial expression, all suggest that this child may have been conscious, at least briefly, after burial. However, the state of decomposition makes it difficult to determine with certainty what occurred and when. But there was more. Dr. Wright took samples, tissue and organ specimens that would be sent to a laboratory in Nashville for analysis. In 1914, toxicology was still in its relative infancy, but certain poisons could be detected. The samples were sealed, labeled, and sent by Railway Express to the state capital. While they waited for results, life in Grassy Cove became increasingly strained. Margaret Cartwright was essentially under house arrest, forbidden to leave the county while the investigation continued. Her sister had taken her in, fearful that Margaret might harm herself or flee. The woman who'd once been the epitome of respectable widowhood was now avoided on the streets. When she ventured out for necessities, conversations stopped. People crossed to the other side of the road. Children were pulled away from her path. Emma Pritchard wrestled with her conscience. She knew she needed to tell the sheriff what she'd observed in the months before Tommy's death. The bruises, the boy's withdrawn behavior, the changes in Margaret after Clayton Murphy arrived. But she also knew that coming forward might condemn a woman she'd once called her dearest friend. For days, Emma lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, hearing that small voice from the coffin echoing in her memory. Finally, she made her decision. She went to Sheriff Moss and told him everything. About the bruises she'd seen on Tommy's arms and legs, about how Margaret had become increasingly isolated, spending most of her time with Murphy, about a conversation she'd overheard at the general store, where Murphy had been complaining about how difficult it was to court a woman who had a child, how kids were expensive and demanding, how he was looking for a partner in life, not a ready-made family. Other witnesses came forward too. Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door to the Cartwrights, reported hearing arguments in the house. She'd heard Tommy crying late at night. She'd heard Margaret yelling at the boy to stop being so needy, to give her some peace. The local pharmacist remembered selling Margaret a bottle of laudanum just a week before Tommy's death. She'd claimed it was for her own insomnia, but the amount she'd purchased was unusually large. The pieces of a terrible picture were coming together. but it was all circumstantial. Nothing proved that Margaret had deliberately harmed her son. Nothing except the testimony of witnesses who claimed they'd heard Tommy's voice from the coffin, accusing his mother of poisoning him. 3 weeks after the exhumation, the toxicology results arrived from Nashville. Dr. Wright read them first, then called Sheriff Moss to his office. The two men sat in silence for several minutes after reviewing the findings. Finally, the sheriff spoke. "Are you certain about this?" Dr. Wright nodded slowly. "As certain as modern science can be. The levels of laudanum in the child's system were approximately 10 times what would be considered a therapeutic dose. Combined with the testimony about the mother purchasing an unusually large quantity of the drug and considering the child's symptoms before death, I believe we have sufficient cause to bring charges." On November 21, 1914, Margaret Cartwright was arrested and charged with the murder of her son, Thomas Edwin Cartwright. The arrest warrant cited death by deliberate poisoning through the administration of toxic quantities of laudanum. The trial was set for January, after the New Year. The arrest sent shockwaves through East Tennessee. A mother murdering her own child was almost unthinkable, even in an era when domestic violence and child abuse existed, but were rarely discussed openly. The press coverage intensified. Journalists camped out in Grassy Cove, interviewing anyone who would talk to them. The story had everything that sold newspapers in 1914. A beautiful widow, a mysterious traveling salesman, a dead child, poison, and the supernatural element of a voice from beyond the grave. Clayton Murphy was never found. Sheriff Moss sent inquiries to law enforcement agencies across Tennessee and neighboring states, but the salesman had vanished completely. The boarding house keeper in Grassy Cove had little information about him. He'd paid in cash, carried no references, and left behind nothing but a few toiletries and a cheap suit that didn't fit properly. It was as if he'd been a ghost himself, materializing long enough to destroy a family before evaporating back into nothingness. The trial began on January 12, 1915. The courthouse in Pikeville, the county seat, was packed beyond capacity. People stood in the hallways, pressed against the windows, desperate to hear every word. Margaret appeared in black mourning clothes, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. She'd lost significant weight during her incarceration and looked decades older than her 28 years. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented the toxicology evidence showing lethal levels of laudanum in Tommy's system. They called the pharmacist who'd sold Margaret the large quantity of the drug. They brought forth neighbors who testified about arguments and Tommy's bruises. They detailed the relationship with Clayton Murphy and his convenient disappearance. But the most dramatic testimony came from the witnesses who'd been in the church that October morning. One by one, they took the stand and described what they'd heard. The voice from the coffin, the accusations, Margaret's desperate reaction. Some witnesses were more certain than others about the exact words, but all agreed they'd heard something emanating from that sealed pine box. The defense attorney, a capable lawyer from Chattanooga named Robert Carlyle, faced an uphill battle. He argued that the toxicology evidence was unreliable, that the new science couldn't be trusted. He suggested that Tommy might have accidentally ingested the laudanum that children sometimes got into medicine cabinets. He brought character witnesses who spoke of Margaret's devotion to her son, her regular church attendance, her upstanding reputation before Murphy's arrival. But when it came to the voice from the coffin, Carlyle had to tread carefully. He couldn't outright deny that people had heard something. There were too many credible witnesses. Instead, he suggested alternative explanations, gases released from the decomposing body creating sounds that the hysterical crowd interpreted as words, mass hallucination brought on by grief and suggestion, even the possibility of some kind of ventriloquism or trickery by an unknown party trying to frame his client. The prosecution countered with expert testimony from Dr. Wright, who explained that while bodies do release gases during decomposition, they don't form coherent words in the English language. He noted that the phenomenon had occurred before the coffin was opened, meaning the body hadn't been disturbed in a way that might release gases suddenly. Margaret herself took the stand, against her attorney's advice. She was a compelling witness, her grief apparent, her voice breaking as she spoke about her love for her son. She admitted to the relationship with Murphy, admitted it had been inappropriate, admitted she'd been lonely and made poor choices. But she vehemently denied harming Tommy. He died of a fever, she insisted, her hands gripping the witness stand rail until her knuckles were white. I gave him the medicine the doctor prescribed. I sat with him every moment. I held him as he died. What those people heard in that church, I don't know what it was, but it wasn't my son. My son is dead. I saw him die. I buried him. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. He asked Margaret to explain the laudanum purchase. She claimed it was for her own use, for insomnia and anxiety after her husband's death. He asked about Tommy's bruises. She said boys got bruises playing. He asked about Clayton Murphy. She broke down sobbing and couldn't answer. Then the prosecutor asked the question that sealed her fate. Mrs. Cartwright, did Mr. Murphy ever suggest that your son was an impediment to your relationship? Margaret's silence lasted too long. Her attorney objected, but the damage was done. In that hesitation, the jury saw guilt. The trial lasted 8 days. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On January 20th, 1915, they returned with their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Margaret collapsed in her chair. The judge had to gavel for order repeatedly before he could proceed with sentencing. In Tennessee in 1915, murder could carry the death penalty, but it was rarely applied to women. The judge sentenced Margaret Cartwright to life imprisonment with hard labor at the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville. She was taken from the courtroom in chains, still weeping, still proclaiming her innocence. But the story doesn't end there, because in the months and years that followed, strange things continued to happen in Grassy Cove. The white-clappered church where Tommy's coffin had spoken became a place people avoided. Services were moved to a new building on the other side of town. The old church stood empty, and local children claimed they could hear crying coming from inside, especially on October nights when the mist lay heavy in the valley. Tommy's grave became a site of both fascination and fear. Some people left flowers and toys, treating it as a tragic memorial. Others stayed far away, convinced that something unnatural lingered there. Visitors to the cemetery reported feeling watched, hearing whispers they couldn't quite make out, experiencing sudden drops in temperature near the small headstone that read, Thomas Edwin Cartwright, 1907-1914, gone too soon. Herman Fisher, the carpenter who'd built the coffin, never built another one. He sold his business within 6 months of the trial and moved his family to Chattanooga. Before he left, he confided to Reverend Blackwood that he had nightmares almost every night. In his dreams, he was building coffins, and every time he sealed a lid, he heard scratching from inside. He heard small voices begging to be let out. He heard children accusing him of trapping them in darkness. Dr. Hendricks, the elderly physician, died less than a year after the trial. Some said it was old age, that he'd been in his 70s and his time had simply come. But those close to him knew he'd been tormented by guilt. He'd signed Tommy's death certificate without performing a thorough examination. He'd declared the boy dead in that coffin, without checking as carefully as he might have. What if the child had been in some kind of coma or cataleptic state? What if he'd buried a living boy? The question haunted Hendricks until his final breath. Emma Pritchard, who'd testified against her former friend, found herself ostracized by some in the community and praised by others. She was called a hero for speaking truth and a betrayer for condemning Margaret. The division split families and friendships. Emma eventually moved away with her husband and children, seeking a fresh start somewhere her face wasn't associated with Tennessee's most notorious murder trial. Margaret Cartwright served 15 years in prison. By all accounts, she was a model prisoner. She worked in the prison laundry, attended chapel services faithfully, and maintained her innocence to anyone who would listen. In 1930, her case came up for review. New evidence had emerged, witnesses who'd been too afraid to come forward during the trial. Several people now testified that Clayton Murphy had been seen in the area weeks after Tommy's death, contradicting the narrative that he'd fled immediately. A traveling preacher came forward claiming Murphy had confessed to him in confidence about giving Margaret medicine to help her son sleep better, so the two adults could spend time alone. Murphy had apparently bragged about how easy it was to manipulate a lonely widow. The preacher, bound by the confidentiality of confession at the time, now felt compelled to speak out. Most significantly, a new expert review of the trial evidence suggested the toxicology results might have been misinterpreted. The laboratory that performed the original testing had used methods that were standard in 1914, but by 1930 were considered unreliable. A retest of preserved tissue samples found laudanum present, but possibly at levels that could be explained by normal therapeutic use, especially if the child had been given doses over several days, as Margaret claimed. On the basis of this new evidence, and considering she'd served 15 years of exemplary imprisonment, Margaret's sentence was commuted. She was released from prison in March of 1930. She was 44 years old but looked much older, her hair completely white, her face lined with the marks of years of hardship and grief. She didn't return to Grassy Cove. She couldn't. The community that had once been her home was now the site of her greatest trauma. Instead, she moved to Knoxville and lived under an assumed name. She worked as a seamstress, the same trade she'd practiced before tragedy destroyed her life. She never remarried, never had other children, lived quietly and anonymously until her death in 1954. But here's what keeps this story alive more than a century later. There are elements that don't fit neatly into any rational explanation, elements that continue to haunt researchers and historians who study the case. First, there's the consistency of the witness testimony. Yes, some details varied, but the core account remained remarkably stable across dozens of witnesses who were interviewed separately. They all described hearing a child's voice. They all described the voice as coming from inside the coffin, not from elsewhere in the church. They all described Margaret's violent reaction to the sound. For mass hysteria to produce such consistency across so many independent accounts is unusual, though not impossible. Second, there's the physical evidence from the exhumation. The broken fingernails, the scratches on the coffin lid, the repositioned hands, the expression on the face. Dr. Wright's assessment that these were consistent with someone buried alive was never successfully challenged. Even modern forensic experts who've reviewed the case photos and descriptions agree that the evidence suggests the child was alive, at least briefly, after being placed in the coffin. Whether he was alive during the funeral service is another question. But the possibility can't be entirely ruled out. Third, there's the matter of the recording device that was never found. If Murphy had indeed planted such a device in the church, what happened to it? Sullivan claimed Murphy retrieved it that night after the church had emptied, but there's no evidence to support this. The church was thoroughly searched multiple times during the investigation and subsequent research. Nothing was ever found. Could Murphy really have removed such a device without anyone noticing, in a small town where strangers were always watched? Fourth, and perhaps most disturbing, there's what happened to the other people involved in the case. Hermann Fischer's nightmares and his abandonment of his trade. Dr. Hendrix's guilt-ridden final year. The church building itself being abandoned and eventually torn down in 1923 because no one would use it. The cemetery where Tommy was buried became a place locals avoided. These aren't the reactions you'd expect if people believed they'd simply been fooled by a hoax or had fallen victim to mass hysteria. These are the reactions of people who experienced something that genuinely traumatized them, something they couldn't rationalize away. And then there are the reports that continued for decades after. In the 1920s, several families who'd moved into the old Cartwright house reported strange occurrences. Children's voices calling for help. The smell of something chemical and sweet, like the odor Hermann Fischer had noticed when measuring Tommy's body. Objects moving on their own, particularly in the bedroom where Tommy had died. One family lasted less than 3 months before moving out. The house eventually fell into disrepair and was demolished in the 1940s. In the 1950s, researchers from Vanderbilt University conducted a study of the case as part of a larger project on mass psychology and group delusion. They interviewed 15 surviving witnesses from the original funeral. What they found was surprising. Most of the witnesses, when pressed, admitted that their memories of the event had become somewhat unreliable over the decades. But all 15 maintained that they had heard something come from that coffin. Several broke down in tears during the interviews, saying they'd spent 40 years trying to forget that sound and had never succeeded. One witness, a woman named Ruth Templeton, who'd been 17 at the time of the funeral, provided particularly compelling testimony. She'd been sitting in the second row, close enough to the coffin that she could have reached out and touched it. She described the voice as definitely coming from inside the box, muffled but distinct. She said the words were exactly as she'd reported them in 1914, and she'd never wavered in her account because she'd written down what she heard the same day it happened, before talking to anyone else about it. Her contemporaneous journal entry, which the researchers verified was written in 1914 ink and paper, matched her 1950s testimony almost word for word. So, we're left with a mystery that refuses to resolve itself cleanly. The most likely explanation, based on evidence and probability, is that Clayton Murphy murdered or helped murder Tommy Cartwright, and either engineered a hoax or took advantage of mass hysteria to frame Margaret. But the edges of that explanation don't quite line up with all the facts. There are gaps, anomalies, pieces that stick out awkwardly no matter how you try to fit them into a neat narrative. And that's what makes this case so fascinating and so disturbing. It exists in that uncomfortable space between the rational and the inexplicable. It forces us to confront questions we'd rather not ask. Questions about how far a parent might go for love or desperation. Questions about how easily communities can turn on their own. Questions about whether justice was served or compounded, and questions about whether there are some phenomena that resist scientific explanation, some events that blur the line between the natural and supernatural. Let's consider for a moment what it must have been like for the people in that church. Put yourself in their shoes. You're sitting in a pew on a cold October morning. You're there to mourn a child, a neighbor's boy you probably watched grow up. The service is proceeding normally. The reverend is reading familiar verses, and then you hear something that shouldn't be possible. A voice where no voice should exist. Your rational mind immediately tries to explain it away. It's the wind. It's someone outside. It's a trick of acoustics. But the sound continues, and it's too specific, too located, too present to dismiss. Other people are reacting, which confirms you're not imagining it. And then the voice says words that are too detailed, too accusatory, too impossible to be anything but intentional communication. What do you do with that experience? How do you process it? You can spend the rest of your life trying to rationalize it, trying to convince yourself it was mass hysteria or a hoax. But deep down, in the part of your mind that remembers exactly what it felt like in that moment, you know what you heard. You know how it made you feel, and you can never quite shake the possibility that the impossible thing actually happened. That's the power of the Tommy Cartwright case. It doesn't matter whether the voice was real or fake, supernatural or engineered. What matters is the experience of the witnesses, the trauma of the community, and the destruction of lives that followed. Real harm came from that event, regardless of its cause. Margaret Cartwright died in 1954 at the age of 68. She died alone in a small apartment in Knoxville, under a name that wasn't the one she was born with. Her obituary, which ran in the Knoxville paper, made no mention of her past. It simply noted that Helen Morrison, seamstress, had passed away peacefully, and services would be private. Only a handful of people attended her funeral, and she was buried in an unmarked grave in a municipal cemetery, far from her son, far from the community that had once been her home. Clayton Murphy, if that was even his real name, was never found. Over the years, there were occasional sightings or rumors. Someone matching his description was supposedly seen in Florida in the 1920s. A con artist arrested in Texas in the 1930s used similar methods but couldn't be definitively linked to the Murphy from Tennessee. An old man dying in a charity hospital in New Orleans in 1947 supposedly confessed to a nurse about murders he'd committed in Tennessee, but he died before anyone could verify his story. None of it was ever confirmed. Murphy remains a ghost, a shadow, a probably killer who got away with it. The town of Grassy Cove still exists, though it's smaller now than it was in 1914. The white clapboard church is long gone. The cemetery remains, and Tommy Cartwright's grave is still there, his small headstone weathered, but readable. Occasionally, curiosity seekers visit, drawn by the story they've read online or heard from older relatives. Some leave flowers. Some take photos. Some claim they feel something unsettling when they stand near the grave. A coldness, a sense of being watched, a sadness that seems to emanate from the ground itself. Are those feelings real or imagined? Are they the residue of genuine supernatural energy, or simply the power of suggestion working on minds that know the terrible story? There's no way to know. There's no way to prove it either way. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some questions meant to stay unanswered. What we can say with certainty is this. In October 1914, something happened in a small Tennessee church that traumatized an entire community. Whether that something was a supernatural occurrence, an elaborate con, or mass psychological phenomenon, it destroyed lives. A child died, possibly murdered. A woman spent 15 years in prison for a crime she may not have committed. A killer, if Murphy was indeed a killer, escaped justice. And dozens of witnesses spent the rest of their lives haunted by what they heard or thought they heard that morning. The case raises uncomfortable questions about justice, about truth, about how we determine guilt and innocence. Margaret's trial was based partly on scientific evidence that we now know was unreliable, and partly on witness testimony about an event that may have been misinterpreted or manufactured. How many other convictions throughout history have been based on similar shaky foundations? How many people have been punished for crimes they didn't commit because the evidence seemed compelling at the time, but was later proven false? And it raises questions about the nature of reality itself. If dozens of sane, sober people all report experiencing the same impossible thing, what do we do with that information? Do we dismiss it because it doesn't fit our understanding of how the world works? Do we search for rational explanations until we find one that's technically possible, even if it's highly improbable? Or do we allow for the possibility that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy, as Shakespeare put it? The scientific method, which has given us so much understanding and progress, requires that we only accept explanations that can be tested and verified. And that's generally a good standard. It keeps us from falling into superstition and pseudoscience. But it also means we sometimes force complex, ambiguous events into boxes that don't quite fit, trimming off the edges that stick out awkwardly, ignoring the data points that don't match our preferred hypothesis. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened in that church. The physical evidence is long gone. The witnesses are all dead. The technology to analyze things like sound propagation and psychological group dynamics didn't exist in 1914, and by the time it did exist, the opportunity to study the event in real time had passed. We're left with documents, testimonies, theories, and an enduring sense of unease. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Tommy Cartwright case isn't about whether ghosts are real or whether voices can speak from beyond death. Perhaps it's about how tragedy echoes through time, how trauma ripples outward, affecting not just the immediate victims but entire communities and even future generations. The people of Grassy Cove carried the weight of that October morning for the rest of their lives. They passed the story down to their children and grandchildren, who passed it to their children. Over a century later, we're still talking about it, still trying to understand it, still feeling its impact. That's the real horror of the story. Not the supernatural elements, not the question of whether the impossible occurred, but the human cost. A child died in fear and possibly in pain. A mother, guilty or innocent, spent 15 years imprisoned and the rest of her life in hiding. A community was torn apart by suspicion and divided by the question of what they'd witnessed. Relationships were destroyed, minds were broken, lives were ruined. And for what? For money? For romance? For freedom from responsibility? Whatever Murphy's motive was, if he was indeed the villain, was it worth the destruction he caused? These are the questions that keep the case relevant long after everyone involved has turned to dust, because human nature hasn't changed since 1914. We still make terrible choices for what seem like compelling reasons at the time. We still betray trust, still hurt the people who depend on us, still rationalize actions we know are wrong. We still get caught up in group thinking, still let fear and suspicion override reason, still see what we expect to see rather than what's actually there. And we're still haunted by the past, still carrying the weight of things that happened long ago, still trying to make sense of events that resist simple explanation. The Tommy Cartwright case is more than just a creepy story about a voice from a coffin. It's a mirror reflecting back our own capacity for both evil and self-deception. Our vulnerability to manipulation, our hunger for certainty, even when certainty isn't available. So, the next time you hear an unexplained sound, the next time something happens that doesn't quite make sense, The next time you're faced with a choice between believing what you experienced or accepting the rational explanation others are offering, think about that October morning in Tennessee. Think about those people sitting in their pews, hearing something that shouldn't be possible, and having to decide in real time what they believed. Think about Margaret Cartwright, whether guilty or innocent, whose life was destroyed by that moment. Think about Tommy, 7 years old, dying in circumstances we'll never fully understand, possibly crying out for help that came too late or never came at all. Think about the community, torn apart by something they couldn't explain and couldn't forget. And ask yourself, what would you have heard that morning? What would you have believed? And if you'd been on that jury, knowing what they knew, seeing what they saw, would you have voted to convict? There's no right answer, and that's what makes it so deeply unsettling. Justice is supposed to be about truth, but what do you do when the truth is unknowable? The grave in Grassy Cove Cemetery is quiet now. Whatever voice spoke or didn't speak that day in 1914 has been silent for more than a century. The church is gone. The witnesses are gone. The defendants and accusers and investigators are all gone. What remains is the story, passed down through generations, adapted and embellished and analyzed, but never fully understood. Some people say that on certain October nights, when the mist hangs heavy in the valley and the wind moves through the limestone bluffs, you can still hear something if you stand near Tommy's grave. A faint crying, like a child calling for his mother. A scratching sound like small fingers on wood. A voice, barely audible, saying words that might be accusations or might just be the wind playing tricks on susceptible minds. Is it real? Is it imagination? Does it matter? The trauma is real. The mystery is real. The questions are real. And they remain unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, a century later. That's the thing about the past. It doesn't stay buried, no matter how deep the grave. Stories like Tommy Cartwright's keep rising up, demanding to be heard, refusing to be forgotten. They remind us that history isn't just dry facts and dates in textbooks. It's human lives, human suffering, human choices, human mysteries. It's children who died too young, and mothers who may or may not have killed them, and communities that tore themselves apart over questions they couldn't answer. And it's us, more than 100 years later, still listening for that voice from the coffin, still wondering what really happened, still trying to make sense of an event that defies our understanding, still carrying the weight of a story that won't let us go, because somewhere deep inside, we recognize something true in it. Something about the darkness humans are capable of, the mysteries we can't solve, and the voices that speak to us across the years, demanding we remember, demanding we witness, demanding we never forget that October morning when the impossible became real, if only for a few terrible minutes. The story of the boy who spoke from his own coffin isn't just about what happened in 1914. It's about what continues to happen every time someone tells the story, every time someone asks the questions, every time someone stands at that grave and listens to the wind. It's about memory and trauma, justice and injustice, truth and mystery. It's about all of us, trying to understand a world that's more complex, more ambiguous, and more haunted than we'd like to believe. And now you've heard the story too. You're part of its continuing life, part of the chain of witnesses stretching back to that October morning. You'll carry it with you, and maybe you'll tell someone else someday, keeping the mystery alive for another generation. Because stories like this don't die. They can't die. They're too powerful, too disturbing, too important. They remind us that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Some voices once heard echo forever, and some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how many years pass, no matter how deep the grave. The boy spoke from his coffin, or didn't speak, or maybe spoke in a way we still don't understand. And the question of what really happened remains suspended in the air, like the mist in Grassy Cove Valley, impossible to grasp, but impossible to ignore. That's where the story lives, in that space between certainty and doubt, between the real and the impossible, between the dead and the living. And that's where it will stay, whispering to us across the decades, asking us to listen, asking us to remember, asking us to witness the mystery that refuses to be solved. If you found yourself captivated by this haunting mystery from Tennessee's past, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Shadow Bloodline brings you deep dives into the darkest corners of history, the unsolved mysteries, and the stories that refuse to stay buried. There are so many more tales waiting to be told, stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. Don't miss out. Subscribe now, and let's explore the shadows together. It's where the story takes an even stranger turn. In 1947, an investigative reporter named Catherine Wells became interested in the Cartwright case. Wells was one of the new breed of female journalists who'd emerged during and after World War II, tackling serious investigative work that had previously been the domain of men. She'd heard about the voice from the coffin and was intrigued by both the supernatural elements and the questions about Margaret's guilt. Wells spent months researching, digging through old court records, tracking down surviving witnesses, and investigating the mysterious Clayton Murphy. What she discovered was remarkable. Murphy wasn't just a traveling salesman. He was a con artist with a long history of targeting widows and divorcees across the South. He would enter a community, identify vulnerable women with property or savings, romance them quickly, and then disappear with whatever he could steal. But in several cases, Wells discovered, Murphy's marks had died under suspicious circumstances. A widow in Georgia had fallen down her stairs just days before she was set to marry Murphy. A divorcee in Alabama had died of what was ruled accidental poisoning from tainted food. A woman in Mississippi had apparently committed suicide by laudanum overdose, though she'd left no note and had seemed in good spirits before her death. In each case, Murphy had been present. In each case, he'd vanished shortly after the death. And in each case, the women had children from previous relationships, children who would have been obstacles to Murphy accessing the women's money or property. Wells's investigation suggested that Murphy was far more than a simple con artist. He might have been a serial killer who specialized in making murders look like accidents or natural deaths. And Tommy Cartwright's death fit the pattern perfectly. A widow with a child, a man who wanted access to whatever resources she had, a child who was in the way, and a death that could plausibly be explained as natural causes. The most chilling part of Wells's investigation came when she tracked down a man named James Sullivan, who'd worked as Murphy's assistant during some of his cons. Sullivan, dying of tuberculosis and wanting to clear his conscience, told Wells that Murphy had often bragged about how easy it was to manipulate women into doing things they never thought they'd do. How you could convince a desperate, lonely woman that her life would be better without the complications of children. How the right combination of drugs could simulate death closely enough to fool a country doctor. How a voice from a coffin could ensure a woman kept her mouth shut and took the blame. Wait, let me make sure you're following this. Sullivan claimed that Murphy had deliberately created the voice from the coffin. But how? How could he have done that? Sullivan's explanation was diabolically clever. He said Murphy had visited the church the night before the funeral. He'd hidden a small device inside the church, possibly near or under the coffin's planned resting place. It was a primitive recording device, the kind that was just becoming available in the early 1900s. Murphy had recorded a child's voice, probably using another child he'd convinced to play act, saying the exact words that would condemn Margaret. The scratching sounds? Sullivan said Murphy had set up a simple mechanism with a music box-style component that would activate when the coffin was placed in position, creating the scratching sounds that drew attention before the voice played. The whole thing had been timed to occur during the service for maximum impact. If Sullivan was telling the truth, it meant Margaret Cartwright had been set up. Murphy had poisoned Tommy, or convinced Margaret to give the boy increasing doses of laudanum until a lethal amount accumulated in his system, then ensured she would take the blame by creating supernatural evidence that captivated and terrified an entire community. By the time anyone could think rationally about what they'd heard, Margaret's reaction had already condemned her. Catherine Wells published her findings in a series of articles that ran in newspapers across Tennessee in 1948. The revelation caused a sensation. Many people who'd testified at Margaret's trial came forward to recant or express doubt. Several admitted that in the hysteria of the moment, they might have convinced themselves they heard specific words when really they'd only heard muffled sounds. The human mind is remarkably good at filling in blanks, especially when everyone around you seems certain about what they heard. But here's the problem. Clayton Murphy was never found. He was never caught, never tried, never made to answer for any of the suspected murders. He simply vanished into the vastness of America, probably changing his name, probably moving on to new victims. Without him, without the supposed recording device that was never located, Wells's theory remained just that, a theory. Margaret Cartwright, living quietly in Knoxville, under her assumed name, read the articles. Catherine Wells tracked her down and offered to interview her, to give her a chance to tell her side of the story. Margaret refused. She told Wells through a handwritten note that some doors, once closed, should remain shut, that she'd served her time, paid for her sins, real or perceived, and just wanted to live what remained of her life in peace. She never publicly confirmed or denied Wells's theory. So what really happened in that church in October 1914? Did a dead child somehow speak from beyond the grave, using his last moments of consciousness to accuse his murderer? Was it an elaborate con, orchestrated by a calculating killer who used both drugs and primitive technology to frame an accomplice? Or was it mass hysteria, a community so primed for tragedy and scandal that they convinced themselves they heard something that never existed in any coherent form? The rational explanation, the one most historians accept, is some combination of the con theory and mass hysteria. Murphy likely did poison Tommy, either doing it himself or manipulating Margaret into administering lethal doses. The voice from the coffin was probably either a hoax Murphy engineered or a case of collective delusion, with gases from the body creating sounds that the terrified, suggestible crowd interpreted as words. The specific accusations Margaret supposedly tried to stop them from hearing could have been details filled in after the fact, as stories were retold and memories reshaped themselves. But here,